Since the announcement of their decision to remove Mythics, I've heard and seen some very interesting opinions that are kind of just a collective celebration at how much better the game will be and how much of a failure Mythics were. And to some extent, I can not only understand this sentiment, but can also agree. We've had so many frustrating balance issues and metas that made the game significantly worse over the past few years since Mythics were introduced, like the Gore Drinker Assassin meta when assassins would one-shot you while also being quite tanky, the Sunfire Skirmisher meta when it used to give tenacity and the on-hit effect that hypercarries like Yi couldn't be stopped by CC anymore in 1v9, the Stridebreaker Dash meta when Garen could dash onto you with a slow and then one-shot you while being a borderline tank, and so much more. But where my opinion differs from almost everyone else in the community is that I believe the Mythics are actually something really good for the game, and it's just that they were poorly executed in a few pretty significant ways. This is because the intention of the Mythic Item system was to allow for more powerful and interesting items that are more fun to use and make the system feel more interesting. But when it actually came down to it, most of them ended up just being legendaries with better stats and numerous issues that have plagued the game since their introduction. So this is what I want to talk about today, going over some of the issues, how we could fix those issues, and why I believe League of Legends could be better with the Mythic system. So subscribe if you aren't, leave a like if you enjoy, and let's hop right in. In total, I believe there are 6 primary issues with the Mythic system, being a lack of options and diversity that makes the game feel very streamlined and stale, overly broad range stats and effects that make champions too well-rounded, fundamentally game-breaking effects that break the game and are unfun diverse, a very poor execution of the items being gameplay defining that makes them feel uninteractive and not impactful, the power influx specifically as a first item power spike that influences Snowball's potency and frequency, and issues not specific to the item system that have a drastic effect on them, like the stats and champion kits themselves. And I know this sounds like a lot, and it kind of is, so I'll be as brief as possible here, but you can also always skip around with the playback bar segments, or increase the playback speed to fit your preference. Starting with the first, Riot believe that one of the biggest flaws of the Mythic item system is that in order to support the wide cast of characters, they would need to add a lot more Mythics, where rather than just 3 or 4 per class, they would need to have 2 or 3 for each subclass so that no champions are left out, which is a problem because Riot believe the amount of items we have now is already too much, since new players are often faced with decision paralysis at the amount of items that then causes them to quit. But I actually disagree with both of these notions, being that Riot would need to add too many new items to support every champion, and that we are at capacity, because the item system is designed based on balance sets, where rather than considering champions at all, the items are their own entity and are actually based on a balance set of what the classes feature. For example, an assassin is based around burst, which means if Pantheon builds assassin, he foregoes the survivability and consistency that the fighter balance items would provide, morphing his balance into that of an assassin by building their items, or at least that's what it should be, because as I've mentioned in a few other videos now, the idea still needs work, like how assassin items feature a ton of consistency and how fighter items feature a ton of burst. But this is why the Mythics shouldn't try to consider champions at all, and should instead try to define themselves by a purpose and let champions morph their playstyle and balance around the options they choose. So for example, say you build Leandries, then you should be foregoing burst for the consistency through Leandries being something like 40 AP and 45 ability haste, while Luden's loses all of its ability haste and mana to be more defined as a burst choice. And then in terms of being at the max amount of items because of new players, I also disagree entirely, because the new player experience isn't a problem of complexity, but rather of barrier to entry, which are two very different things. Reducing the barrier to entry is done through new player experience systems, like a good recommendation system, a good tutorial, an auto-buy feature, and more, whereas system complexity is more for the replayability of the game once you're familiar with it, which is an extremely important attribute League should be considering since replayability is, at its core, what League is inherently built on. And instead, we actually need far more items, because League's replayability is straining with each day, where the game feels extremely stale and stagnant since there are so few items you can actually go, which not only makes the item system feel less diverse to interact with, but also makes every enemy Yone feel the same because there's no possibility for diversity, not even considering the fact that Mythics are essentially a separate entity to Legendaries through being unique, meaning you aren't weighing every item when considering a Mythic or a Legendary. The second issue, being the overly broad-range stats and effects, refers to another issue they addressed in the same dev blog, where they believe that the items need to cast a wide net so that they can be picked up by many different champions. But this again relates back to the idea of what items are meant to be, where if they're based on a purpose rather than based on the champions, then this issue can be fixed as well. but I want to actually go a step further with this and say the broad range stats are not an issue specific to Mythics, but legendaries as well. And since I did talk about this twice in the last 3 videos I made, going into much further detail there, I won't waste too much time reiterating, but for the people that didn't see those, essentially the balance between consistency and burst was lost nearly a decade ago with the rise of ability haste, back then being CDR, where it was treated as a supplementary stat that everyone uses, rather than what it should have been, being the primary stat based on consistency in a similar manner to what attack speed was. And what ended up happening was that all of those burst-based items suddenly had a massive influx of consistency that pushed them ahead of all champions and items based on consistency. Which is why we then saw consistency largely just removed from the game in favor of pushing more burst into the consistency side to match that power creep. This is why we saw the complete annihilation of the entire class of attack speed based fighters in favor of burstifying them and basing them on abilities, as well as being a big reason why marksmen have been so harshly affected over the years, because their entire class design is fundamentally based around high consistent damage, which is also why only very recently have we seen marksmen start to be a bit more playable, because their items were progressively burstified with AD being the primary stat on a majority of their items rather than attack speed, essentially just finally raising them to the power creep level of burst. And this is why we need to make attack speed and ability haste primary stats on the items they're on again, while removing them from the burst based items that shouldn't have that level of consistency they provide, forcing the player to choose between one or the other, or go for a more mixed balance through building different items, rather than building one item with everything, which again helps emphasize that balanced set item design. Next is the fundamentally game-breaking effects, most notably with the dash-based Mythics and Everfrost's hard CC, which are problematic because mobility and CC are attributes that should not be attainable in the item system due to the fact that they are amplifiers rather than direct power, which makes them very difficult to balance and should be kept only to the kits. What I mean is that mobility and CC don't outright increase your power, but rather make the power you do have easier to utilize, which means more situations end up becoming a game of stat check. A good way to explain it is through threat ranges, which are essentially just the radius at which you can apply your power. For example, Zed throwing W and being in your face in an instant, compared to the old Udyr needing to somewhat slowly run up to you. This means Zed can apply the power he has much more effectively, which makes him significantly better at snowballing. This is why so many infamous pub stomping champions earn their reputation, because they have larger threat ranges than normal champions, meaning unlike a Singed, Urgot, or old Udyr, where you have that counterplay option of playing more passively against them, you literally just can't do that against a high threat range champion like Zed, Nidalee, or Evelynn. And this is also why snowballing has become so much more prevalent over the years as mobility and CC were power crept, both through kit-based power creep and the ability haste power creep of becoming more spammable, as well as by champions like Zeri, Yuumi, and Aurelion Sol have been such sore spots for the balance team, because the amplifiers make them very sensitive to tuning changes, making even just a small number change much more drastic than on a champion like old Udyr or Urgot. And this is also why ganking has become so much more frustrating to deal with over the years, because the damage power creep was amplified by the increase in threat ranges, meaning getting away from a gank was significantly less doable because kill potential takes both damage and threat range into account. So when we give this to every champion in the game, we're essentially just adding that amplifier that makes champions overly sensitive to tuning changes, while also making them significantly more frustrating to deal with when ahead due to how much they influence snowballing, which is why many older champions were so unpopular and were reworked because of their popularity. Because even though they were really fun, they were objectively just worse in an ever power creeping game state, which is also why the only way I was able to have fun playing the old Udyr was by rushing old Prowler's Claw into Youmuu's and Edge Knight, because it helped increase his threat range and made him slightly playable. And of course, mobility isn't the only amplifier attribute, as the same applies to both range and CC as well, although to less of an extent because CC has a form of counterplay through tenacity and cleansing effects, and range is directly hard countered by both mobility and CC, which makes them both objectively worse than mobility when compared. The next two issues are thankfully quick ones, but are both very significant, being the poor execution of Mythics as gameplay defining, and the influx of power. The poor execution of Mythics as gameplay defining refers to how a majority of Mythics don't feel like Mythics, but rather just feel like legendary items with better stats. For example, Leandri's is kind of just more damage when you hit an enemy with little to no interactivity or impact that you can actually feel like a Heartsteel in its satisfying proc. And I know they did sort of mention this when they first released the Mythics, where they wanted to keep many of the items they already had so that the players weren't suddenly thrust into a massive new update all at once. And I can agree with this sentiment, as releasing too significant of a change is a very prevalent quit moment, but the problem is that they could have easily made the items more satisfying and actually feel like Mythics while still retaining that same core identity as their previous iterations. For example, Leandri's could have retained its core identity as the burn item, but make the passive burn relatively weak most of the time, then have an active for 6 or so seconds that makes your damaging abilities apply a much more impactful burn, with more satisfying audio and visuals for that mythic item feel. Another is Infinity Edge, and how it's easily one of the most boring items in the game, not even just the Mythics, where instead of how it is now, it should do something like have an active that temporarily halts all your crits for 4 seconds, and then at the end of the duration applies all of the damage from those crits at once to all the targets you hit, with a satisfying Infinity Strikes animation, kind of like the Death by 1,000 Cuts idea. In total, out of every mythic in the game, I would say there are only 5 mythics that actually feel good to use, being Gale Force, Everfrost, Goredrinker, Protobelt, and Heartsteel, with Night Harvester being an honorable mention. And if you'll notice, 3 of these 5 are the fundamentally game-breaking effects I just talked about, because for them to work, they had to be actives, which unless they are especially uninspired and boring active effects, like Locket, Shirelia's, and Stridebreaker, they naturally end up feeling more interactive and satisfying to use, which is why I would say Redemption of all items feels more like a mythic than most mythics. And then in terms of the influx of power, this issue refers to how mythics heavily influence Snowball's frequency and potency. This is because the intention of the mythics were to be as a first buy item, which is the most sensitive point in the game where a power difference has the most effect, which means stat checking and stomps are far more common ever since the introduction of mythics. This is why the game was in such an abysmal state for well over a year, where dying once in lane was pretty much just an instant loss before they finally added the objective bounties to try and counterweight some of the snowball. But personally, I really dislike the objective bounties because all it does is put more gold in the hands of the losing team, rather than a change that would try to slow down snowballing and stat checking, essentially just adding more power creep to comebacks rather than reducing the power creep of snowballs, which ended up with faster game times and even more drastic power creep in a game where people have been begging for a reduction of it for years now. And then for the last issue, which is kind of a dual point, we have the non-specific item issues that influence the item system, specifically causing it to be worth less and need to accommodate. The first of these is related to the champion kits, not only with the hit or miss item interactivity champions have, where some champions like Thresh have a lot of fun item interactivity, while others like Renata have very little interactivity and more forced artificial power, like percent max HP damage and overly strong effects like Renata's R, which uses enemy damage rather than scaling off her own, but also because of how truly unbalanced the game actually is, with champions having no underlying structure that they're based off of, which lets Riot get away with champions like Kayn and Yone that are objectively just better than everyone else in a non-number based way. This means because champions are so unique and have no real structure to them, champions like Riven and Yone are allowed to exist that kinda just randomly don't have mana, which forces items to accommodate for this and ends up being less interesting and diverse because of it. For example, say we introduced an Enchanter Mythic that has an active that reduces your armor and magic resist by half, but increases your healing and shielding by 20% for the duration. This item would be super cool to have in the game because it provides a high skill risk-reward trade-off, where while yes you could be much more impactful in a fight, you are also much more fragile and need to be more acutely aware of your positioning so that the enemy can't just one-shot you in the blink of an eye and remove you from the fight entirely. But because Yuumi and her anchoring gimmick of being invulnerable and untargetable exists, that item simply can't exist without creating a major balance issue where Yuumi uses that item way better than anyone else could. And since we can't just place a subtext on an item that reads, Yuumi is half as effective with this item, Yuumi ends up hurting every other enchanter in the game simply by existing. And if it was added, it would create a scenario where Yuumi would then need to be individually nerfed to consider it, which now means that if she builds any other mythic, she is now that amount weaker, which then creates an unhealthy dependency on that item because she is literally balanced around it. And this problem is everywhere in the game, where there's so much design debt like Silas and Viego that hurt the item system that something as simple as a mythic that alters your resource wouldn't even be possible, despite being something that I think would be super cool to see. Like imagine there was a set where one changed your resource into Fury, another into Heat, another into Health costs, and another into Rage, with each featuring more gameplay defining differences. For example, Fury would be defined by your ultimate no longer having a cooldown, but needing to be reduced by being in combat like Shyvana, which comes with the pros of potentially being able to use it more, but the downside of obviously needing to be in combat to reduce it, which could put a target on your back. Heat would be defined by the overheat mechanic, where you can spam freely, but need to be careful not to overheat yourself and be locked out of your abilities mid-fight and make yourself a prime target, and so on for health costs and needing to heal it back, and rage and needing to ramp up in a fight. But because there are randomly champions like Riven and Yone who don't have a resource, and more importantly, champions that have kits balanced specifically around their own resource like Vladimir, Rumble, or Tryndamere, it would simply just be too much of a headache to make work. But now, say every champion was based on mana, then this idea could work much better because there is that underlying structure that the items can be based off of. It means that the item system can be far more interesting and diverse, meaning that even if you versed a Riven 4 times in a row, each Riven could be uniquely different and prefer different playstyles, feeding into that core replayability that League is built on. And then as a quick honorable mention is that items are a fundamental piece of the balance of the game. So upending the entire item system, we're essentially going back 3 years worth of balancing and changes while only changing the items, meaning any champion and rune changes in those 3 years will need to be balanced all over again, which could be pretty shitty. But either way, that's it for today's topic. Let me know what you guys think. Was I able to change your opinion on the Mythic Item system, and would you rather see it kept and just properly executed this time, or would you rather they just scrap the idea altogether despite the numerous benefits it provides? Or maybe you have some other suggestion for how they could fix or replace the Mythic system. Feel free to leave a comment below as I read every single one, or you can join the Discord and share it with a group of like-minded people for a more interactive conversation. All links are in the description below. Subscribe if you aren't, leave a like if you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.